I'm Rene Morales. I'm curator here at PAMM. Thank you very much for coming. And it is my real pleasure tonight to have this conversation with Gary Simmons. Gary, I just want to start by thanking you for doing this project. It's been such a pleasure to work with you on this, and just from beginning to end. And it's really been a dream for many years for me to do a project like this with you. I feel great about the results. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here and work with everybody at the museum. And our working together has been fantastic. So can't ask for a better relationship. It's fantastic.
Well, I figure that many of you probably haven't had a chance to see the mural, so I'll just start by describing it verbally very briefly. Gary just completed a new commissioned site-specific project for PAMM's very dramatic double-height gallery on the second floor here. This soaring space with a tremendous 30-foot by 29-foot wall on the back end of the wall that we covered with drywall, and it was painted black, and Gary painted on top of that surface. The imagery consists of a series of nicknames of famous African-American boxers from history that swirls down in a way that's very similar to very evocative of film credits. So you have this very pregnant history, this very full, rich history of boxing in this country, with all the implications that's had for race relations, together with an evocation of film and all of those kinds of illusions. So, with that said, we'll go to our first slide. This is a work that Gary just very recently completed at Metro Pictures in New York, which deals with boxing. And I just wanted to kind of use our way into this discussion by talking a little bit about the significance that boxing has had in your work over the years. So can you tell us a little bit about this project?
Boxing has been a fascination of mine for a long time, and I would say that it's not so much about the violence of two men beating the crap out of each other as much as the politics that are and issues that are raised around it. And I think that boxing is one of the few sports, if not the only sport, that's sort of transcended certain figures within boxing sort of transcended the idea of sport and entertainment and popular culture and kind of stitched together some of the social issues that were present at the time, and had this way of creating a platform for boxers to speak to political issues such as Muhammad Ali, Jack Johnson, folks like that. Taking that in, I've done a number of pieces on boxing in the past, using some of these as starting points. And the show that's at Metro right now is a collection, for the most part, of boxing posters, historical boxing posters that I've manipulated, and created a kind of collaging of all of these images and references in these inkjet prints that you're looking at. They're individual, I think there's 165 or 168 individual posters. They're all uniques, and this piece comes in a sort of set format. And I used the construction site as a place, a visual reference to the notion of constructing or deconstructing, and the idea of building something or taking something down at the surface. So that's what the plywood really was sort of referencing.
So this work here I'd like to talk about briefly. It's called Step into the Arena, the Essentialist Trap. It's from almost exactly 20 years ago. And it just shows the depth of your engagement with the sport. So here, this is a replica of a boxing ring with dance steps painted on the floor, kind of chalkboard effect that you're so known for. But so on one hand, it's very much a reference to Andy Warhol, right? He did a series of dance steps or paintings, but there's something really significant about the choice of dance. Right?
Yeah, I've always looked at boxers as, you know, I was always fascinated by the way two boxers move around a ring together, almost the way that two lovers would dance in a ballroom together. And I thought that there was this interesting sort of clash between the violence of the sport and the beauty or romance of the sport. You know, there's this whole notion of the sweet science, all those things that are attached to it. So, you know, I wasn't shy in referencing Warhol. I think it certainly is a reference. The arena being this place where the act and, you know, these boxers are performing for the public or the masses, and often they're, you know, boxers of color. So I was really, you know, interested in kind of questioning some of the issues there and clashing that together with art historical references as well.
So the particular dance that you're mapping out there is called the cakewalk, and I read somewhere that it's often associated with racist minstrel shows in the late 19th century or the 20th century. So, you know, it's a very powerful, very direct statement in a way about the ways in which boxing has served as a stage for the propagation of racist ideas. At the same time, though, well, I think another really important aspect of this has to do with spectacle and this idea of entertainment, the link between boxing, race, and entertainment, which I think is something that was really very central to the piece that you created upstairs. So I want to get into that later. But you know, this the way that this piece frames boxing as a very problematic arena in the history of boxing. That's one dimension that comes across very clearly in this piece. But I think in later work, including the piece that we just talked about in Metro and the piece that you've done here, I think there's somewhat more of an ambiguity about the way that the sport is presented, because in fact the sport served as both kind of lightning rod for the projection of very problematic ideas, but it also served time and time again, particularly around certain figures that you identified indirectly through their nicknames here. The Galveston Giant references Jack Johnson, Mahogany Mauler, Joe Louis, figures who have used this stage on which they have been set up to kind of participate in this racist game, this racist spectacle, but who have used that stage for a really incredibly rich tradition of transgression, of defiance. So I think the use of the nicknames in this piece, on one hand, they have the effect of redoubling the sense of how they dehumanize the figures that they were associated with. But at the same time, the aggressiveness of these nicknames, and the aggressiveness of the piece, just the visual, the aesthetic aggressiveness of that was generated in that room, I think really functions to point to this other side. You know? So my next slide is someone who really, I think, encapsulates this tradition of defiance and transgression. This very courageous tradition. Do you want to say anything else about?
You know, it's interesting looking at when you're making work over the course of time. You're not, you know, I don't know an artist that thinks of in a historical way. And I once had a conversation with a kind of mentor, John Baldessari, and he'd been doing a piece that was it sort of referenced his own work from the past, and I said, John, it's interesting that you're, 25 or 30 years, gap between that work and this one almost there's this linkage between two, and are you consciously sort of self-critiquing or using your own work as a platform to have other statements? And you see, it's a very interesting moment when an artist can actually reference his own work. And I've always held on to that statement in that conversation because I thought it was very interesting, and I always thought, wow, I can't wait to get to that moment in my life, professional life, where I can actually reference my own work again. So it wasn't conscious doing that, going back to boxing. It's always been an interest and a thread that comes through. I think that piece here deals with more of the trace of physical bodies moving through space, and that kind of exploration. And the piece that's in the galleries now, I think, has a different kind of trace, a different mechanism, a different kind of hidden source that's there that I'm still interested in investigating, where the things are masked or uncovered and blurred, if you will, between the representation and the abstraction. And so that, I think, is still a common thread. So, your point is pretty spot on.
Well, with that as sort of setup, I thought it would be nice for us to kind of delve deeper into what has become one of my favorite topics in the last few weeks as I've been researching for this project, which is boxing history. And going back to this idea of the sport serving as a venue or a place to broadcast this resistance, this tradition of resistance. I wanted to talk a little bit about Jack Johnson, the Galveston Giant.
The Galveston Giant.
Right. I think this is one of your favorites, and also one of my favorites too, among the names that you've listed.
Yeah, I think that I can definitely, Jack Johnson comes in. You don't have too many heroes, but I think that he's one of those figures. I don't know if I have a hero per se, but he's definitely a figure that I admire from the past. In boxing, I think he's a controversial figure. He's a sexy figure. He's a mysterious figure. He's a really scary figure at the same time. And he was very complicated. And I think that he played with popular culture and social issues on a very by himself, with no history behind him. And he was a very brave human being for doing that, taking on the challenges that he did. And I think he's one of the earliest pop cultural figures that actually could, sort of poke at the public and people become fascinated. And he created these sort of rifts between people that hated him and people embraced him and loved him. It's actually kind of interesting, this is a sidebar, but I don't know if everybody is involved in social media, but there's this Kim Kardashian photograph that's going around. And I don't know if you've seen this photograph. It's a stunning image. But it's interesting the way that somebody, I'm not a Kim Kardashian fan, so don't get me wrong, everybody get up and leave. But I think it's interesting the way that a figure is able to manipulate the public in a certain way, create a certain kind of fascination. And this is a person that, for the most part, has no recognizable talent, other than the fact that she can poke the public. And I think that is an amazing talent in and of itself. That she doesn't really have, she's not an actress, well, sort of, kind of, but, she has done sort of films that we can talk about. But she doesn't, she doesn't sing, she doesn't act, she doesn't make art, she doesn't write, she doesn't do much of anything. She's just sort of this figure that continues to morph and change, and people are fascinated with her. If you turn on your phone right now and went onto Twitter, she's trending. For 3 days straight now, this woman's trending off of a photograph that she was able to take. And so I think that that's a very complicated structure that she is involved in there. And if you will, Jack Johnson, to bring it back to the conversation, was almost the originator of that on a political stage. And so there was a real, there was a tooth behind what she's watered it down, but he's, had created a platform for people to speak from.
I think that's a really interesting point, and it gets to one of the aspects that makes this history so powerful, which is that, well, this image here is still from a film. Actually, well, this one definitely is. This is one he's, this is still from a film. And boxing was really the first mass spectator sport. It was much more conducive to being filmed than, say, baseball or something like that. Often it was one of the things that made it very lucrative very early on, and we're talking about the late 1800s, early 1900s, was that it was often played at movie theaters just before the main movies. So before your Charlie Chaplin movie, you would get to watch it out. And that was one of the ways that so much money was generated, this industry that was created so quickly, so immediately. At the same time, one thing that happened in boxing that is interesting is that with the introduction of the new rules that mandated gloves, weight classes, etc., you had this whole group, this whole line, this tradition of kind of back alley brawling prize fighters who are often ethnic minorities or racial minorities, suddenly becoming eligible to compete against a much more upper class, white sporting world, the whole arena of sport. So from its very beginning, boxing was both highly public, very much a spectacle, and also very charged with it because of these interracial contests. Both of the two things very much fed into each other: the spectacle and this idea of boxing as a lightning rod for racial confrontation. And Jack Johnson, I think you're right, was very early and very prescient in learning and understanding the power of that combination, the power of that. Ultimately, he was destroyed for that. There was the passage of the Mann Act, otherwise known as the White Slavery Act, that came crashing down on him after his marriage to a white woman. Here's a great picture of it just sort of speaks a lot about how he lived his life to the fullest. He drove fast cars, wore great clothes, and was very defiant. He said his words were, "I am not a slave. I can choose who I want to love, and it's not up to any other man to tell me."
And who's going to challenge him? I mean, you can't really step up to Jack Johnson.
Yeah,
You can't do that. I mean, it was. You have to also take into account that here's a guy that followed the champion of the world at the time around on his own coin, by the way. He literally followed him from country to country, challenging the so-called champion at the time to a boxing match. And the champion would duck him for 3 years straight. He ducked him, and finally he knocked him, because boxing is one of those sports that it's not something that you can choose to duck the champion. I mean, eventually the public is going to say this has to happen. And when Johnson got his chance, I mean, he took it and created this space that he basically just took ownership to. And I think that he's a really interesting, fascinating guy. I think that one of the next slides that you had up was, or I'm going to be jumping the gun here since I can see the next slide is. That's the Jeffries fight, is that correct?
Yeah. Well, the Jeffries fight is back here. This is when he won the championship. In both pictures, you can sort of see just how dominant he was over the field. I mean, he looks almost bored in this picture. Right? But this is the one where he won the championship in 1910 in Reno. What else am I going to add to this? Well, you know, something that's really interesting is that you know, he very much used the public power, the power to reach the public, to finally get Jeffries after so many years, I think 10 years of chasing him around to finally fight him. He finally had to bow under that public pressure. At the same time, though, the moment he won, there were these really violent riots that broke out throughout the city, throughout the country, from East Coast to West Coast, usually instigated by people who were angry that the color bar, as they called it, had been broken so publicly, so conspicuously.
Which, you know, I think that's significant. I think that boxing's probably the only sport where, you know, this figure in the ring becomes the voice for an entire community. And I think that, you know, those without voices at the time hung every hope on every punch that he would throw. And I think that Johnson was aware of that. I think that he knew what he represented. I think that he knew what it meant to actually not, that before this man was even counted out, I think he knew that things would explode. And that it was important and significant that those kind of shifts in the social place had to happen. And I don't know another form of entertainment where you have a figure that has so much power with his production. You know, if you look to other sports like baseball or basketball, maybe American football, things like that, you have figures that was, well, I guess there was Jim Brown was pretty significant, but not in the same way that like a Jack Johnson or a Joe Louis, who is coming up, impacted social standing. I think that boxing is probably the sole sport that allowed for that. I also think that we think of boxing in these snippets of like filmic, historical moments. You know, all of the knockouts are recorded on film, and you know, like you were saying before a film in the theater, you would see these sort of boxing clips along with the cartoons, which interestingly enough, I played with a lot of those cartoons as well. So I guess I had something about the pre-film movies or something. I should think about that. But you know, I think that and your memory of those knockouts and those fights are always in terms of film. And I like that sort of sense of nostalgia and how it changes and the way that film ages. It represents a kind of nostalgic moment.
So you can probably tell Jack Johnson has become like one of our favorite topics of conversation. Before I move on, just quickly I wanted to mention a couple of details that are really interesting in the crowd. You can see one black man standing amid the crowd, and I don't want to read too much into this image, you know, but you know, his face I think really conveys a lot, as do the faces of many of the other men around him, looking very aggrieved. Oh, I did want to mention one other thing. So then, just going back to this history of Jack Johnson. So, you know, when he was convicted under the Mann Act, he fled the U.S. and again traveled around the world doing fights, and he spent a lot of time in England. Something that's really interesting and powerful, I think, is that the same kinds of disturbances, the riots that we had seen in the U.S. When he beat Jim Jeffries, you saw in the colonies. So there were riots in India after he defeated a British champion. And so that kind of, the power of his symbolism extended not just into the U.S. Race relations, but really throughout the whole world between the colonies and the colonizers. And that kind of symbolism, I think, is matched in its power only by Joe Louis, really, and someone else. But we'll get to that next. This is a picture of Joe Louis that I love this picture because, again, going back to this idea that these nicknames, part of their purpose was to really dehumanize these men. You know, I think it's important when you see pictures like this, you really see such kind of personal kind of embodiment there. And this is Joe Louis defeating Max Schmeling.
Which is an incredible moment in history, sports history, as well as world history. I think that the idea that well, first it's you have to mark the idea that after Johnson there was a long period of time where basically a black boxer was not allowed to rise to the champion of the world, and Lewis came along and he was the exact opposite of Johnson. He wasn't that sort of outlandish kind of demonstrative guy. He didn't buy Cadillacs and date flashy women and buy jewelry. He wasn't that guy. He was the complete opposite. He was almost a machine. And I think that Joe Louis actually polarized even the black community at the time, which is interesting because there were folks that thought that he was a pawn of white society, and there were other folks that thought that he was this representation of black community. So he's an interesting sort of figure as a kind of planted figure, and his career as it went was a sort of fascination for me as well, because I think that this fight, there were two fights that Louis and Schmeling fought, and basically Schmeling was handpicked by the Nazi Party, by Hitler, and Schmeling wasn't himself a Nazi, but he was chosen to represent Nazi Germany. And Louis, being the first black figure to actually represent on that stage the United States at the time, hit it almost, it mirrored this kind of World War sort of effect. So it was the first time we had a figure like Louis that was being held up by basically the rest of the world, and hopes, hanging their hopes on the idea that he would knock out this, this horrible Nazi. It's an interesting path that they had. I think he lost the first fight, and he knocked out Schmeling in, I think it was 2 minutes and 14 seconds in Yankee Stadium. And from that very moment on, their lives took very different trajectories. Schmeling went on to become, having lost the fight, a very successful businessman, very wealthy. Louis remained champion for a while, but his life started to unfrazzle, to become frazzled. And interestingly enough, he died, an alcoholic and near poverty. And Schmeling actually reached out to him and helped him financially through a really bad patch at the end of his life. So, we think of these guys and some of the to bring it to the piece that's upstairs, those nicknames are about a kind of dehumanizing these folks, and you never want in your memory to think of them as actually knowing each other or being actively, friendships or any of that outside of the ring. You want to keep that as an enemy thing going. And I think it's an interesting moment where Schmeling reached out and helped Joe Louis.
That's a really interesting point, and it underscores, I think, one of the really subtle themes of the piece upstairs, which is that it's important to distinguish between that pop cultural symbolism and the spectacle and the reality of what's actually happening. The relationship between these two men and his friends really kind of complicates that very simplistic idea of like U.S. versus Allied versus Axis, U.S. versus Germany, black versus white.
Mm-hmm.
So again, here he is putting the hurt on Schmeling. So I just want to digress a little bit and just talk a little bit about Ali, because the piece here has some really interesting resonance with Miami history. Just briefly, Ali when he was Cassius Clay, a very young man, actually trained at the Fifth Street Gym in Miami Beach for his match against Sonny Liston. It was a very important historic match again. I believe, from what the story I've been told, he lived in Overtown. He had to live in Overtown, but would jog across the McCarthy Causeway to train. You could see him jogging back and forth. So it's just a really kind of striking fact of history, of local history, that I wasn't aware of until I started researching this project.
Actually, I have a funny personal moment with Cassius Clay, where when my parents came to this country, they were from the West Indies, and my mother worked for Ebony magazine, and she was very sort of posh at the time, and she was sort of the receptionist at the time, and Cassius Clay came in to Ebony because he was going to do this interview. So she had this exchange with him, and he was very, obviously he was very charismatic and he was flirtatious, and women loved Cassius Clay, and he knew that. And so they had this kind of flirtatious moment. Speed forward. My mother loves to tell that story. It drives my father insane to this day. If we sit at Thanksgiving 2 weeks from today and I bring up the fact that Cassius Clay walked into Ebony magazine and talked to my mom, it's so irritating. It's just the best. I love it. So, anyway, so that's just an aside.
Yeah, and then of course there's this very famous, really powerful image, which is just interesting to think about, again, with this local connection. It's interesting that it happened here, that it was taken here. Now, Cassius Clay, by the time he was preparing for this fight, had already converted to Islam. He was already Muhammad Ali, and he was dying to announce this. He really wanted to announce this publicly. He was convinced by his management, the sponsors, I guess, to at least wait until after the fight. But it's still really significant. As soon as he won this battle, he announced here in Miami that he was no longer Cassius Clay, that he was Muhammad Ali. This is an amazing picture, I think, of Malcolm X taking a photo of Muhammad Ali in a nightclub right here in Overtown, just on the other side of Biscayne from where we are right now.
Do you know who this figure is, sort of right, Ali?
Do you head down this guy here? Who? Sir? Bandini. Maybe during the question and answer session when the mic is going around, Dennis, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more about that history, that would be great. I know you've done a lot of work on this in a recent document.
Just a fantastic photograph. It's just a brilliant photograph with all of those folks together. But I think that Cassius Clay / Muhammad Ali, I think that he took a lot of things that Johnson took to a whole other level. And I think that if you want to think about one pop culture sports figure that really transcended the sport and created political, polarizing moments, Muhammad Ali is that guy. I think that from the time with his embracing Islam to refusing to go to the army, to every step of the way, when he did the Thriller in Manila, and he kind of, here's this fight, and he turned it into a complete spectacle, and there were certain issues between he and Frazier that were internal to the black community that I think that was like uncovering or pulling a bandage on what we see as like private conversations that are not meant to be public.
That's right.
And I think that, so Muhammad Ali there was no stone that he was afraid to turn over, and he was a guy that didn't fear throwing stones in his own house. I think that I cannot think of one pop cultural figure, an actor, or musician, anybody, not Miles Davis, not anybody, that actually used that platform on such a high level of politics
for as a voice. And to this day, I think that you have folks that have never even seen Ali fight. They weren't even born around the time of the end of his career to be able to see. And he is recognizable. I mean, he's revered. He walks in a room, and he, unfortunately, due to the Parkinson's, he can't speak. But people, crowd around him like this incredible icon. And I can't think of anything. Not Michael Jordan, not LeBron James. Sorry to bring up a bad person. But nobody. And I think that there are a lot of sports figures that have a lot of money and power, but they choose not to use their stage as a political platform. And that's one of the reasons why boxing is so interesting for me, is that I think that it's not about the violence, it's about what we also think about boxing historically. We think about it as something from the past. I almost dare anybody in the audience to actually name a professional boxer right now. You hardly know them. But back then, when you were sitting around listening to boxing matches on the radio, you felt like you knew these guys intimately, and yet there was that distance. So I think it's a real interesting sport that you think in a historical, almost memory-based films, still sort of way, and that's one of the fascinating things for me about boxing.
Yeah, just to kind of rephrase it again, I think something about this history it just really clarifies these different models of resistance. I'm really just summarizing what we said earlier, but it's really these very, very different, starkly different modes of resistance, as stark as the different modes of resistance represented by Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Again, in combination with the incredibly public nature of the spectacle as it was filmed and photographed, it made it really important to remember.
I think that's one of the fascinating, for me anyway, one of the fascinating things about this photograph is, having Malcolm X and what he represents. And, we can go on for 3 hours about Malcolm X alone, but I think that, him and his understanding of who he was as a figure, X I'm talking about, and at the time, it was almost challenging Elijah Muhammad within the Black Muslim movement. That's one of the reasons why he ended up getting taken out by it, and I think it's very interesting that he is documenting Cassius Clay and seeing the two of them in the same room at the same time. That's an amazing photograph.
I read somewhere that Muhammad Ali had actually been sort of elevated in status or rank above Malcolm X by Elijah Muhammad. Yeah. Even just the name Muhammad Ali is closer to the prophet than Malcolm X. So just going back to the point you made earlier about how this history also serves as a window into the kinds of very complex dynamics within the Black community.
Yeah. Those are all conversations that you never let outside the house. So I think, and those two figures were not afraid to do that, and that's one of the things that makes them so significant.
So going back finally to the piece, I think the piece very much, this is very characteristic of your work, where it's as if you start with this incredible richness of content, and then you remove from it as much as you can, almost to the point where you're bordering on the line where it becomes impossible for someone to extract or to reconstruct this history from the motif. But you take it right to that line to where it actually becomes so clear, so isolated on this big field, this motif that speaks of this content, that it becomes an invitation, kind of pulls you in and draws you in to do your own work to reconstruct this history, this content. So just going back to that piece, the piece upstairs, I think you're bringing in this history of boxing, but putting it together in a way that I'm not sure you had done it before, with another important theme that runs through your work, which has more to do with the spectacle aspect of boxing, which is your interest in film, which is something that many people have pointed out as far as just the format, this kind of cinemascope format as very much a reference to film, and then within the subject matter itself, often there are many references, such as in this case.
I think film is one of the areas that I draw on the most outside of my own practice. I think that it's something, the moving image in and of itself, I think, is a really interesting, the 24 frames a second, the way that imagery moves over that celluloid and things like that. And when I started making the wall drawings, they were really always, you just touched on it, formatted to a film, a movie screen. And no matter what location I went into, I would size it so that it had a relationship to what a movie screen would appear in the theater. Because I think that a movie theater triggers, or not a movie theater, but a movie screen, well, theaters too, but I think the screen is an object that triggers certain memories personally for a viewer. I think that everybody has a relationship to film in a personal sort of way, even though it's such a public sort of use space. And, first dates happen around film. Some of your people make references to film moments in their daily conversation back and forth. It's something that you can always, that's just like that film that we saw. You mark moments in your personal history around films. We even think about periods of films like Planet of the Apes, or The Towering Inferno, like all of those kinds of Psycho. They have these moments that we mark in our personal history as well as our public. And that's one of the reasons why I use that. So film, I constantly go back. It's also something where I draw a lot of imagery from because of those very reasons.
Or like this piece, which is a reference to a Hitchcock movie titled Marnie, which was a movie from 1964, which, without going into it too much, has all sorts of kind of sublimated anxieties about the kind of changes that were happening to society at the time as a result of the civil rights movement. What's interesting about the piece here in this context is that you had a very unusual, very different format. You know, a vertical, very sweeping, high wall. And I think it was just incredibly intelligent and astute for you to react to that wall by bringing in film credits, because that kind of preserves the discussion with the film, but very much works with the space, works with the dimensions of the space.
It's perfect for it. It feels like a film, strip flying through the floor. And I was always drawn to different moments of film. And one of those things is the credits at the end. And usually people will watch a film and they'll get up and leave the theater. I'm one of those guys that sits and watches to the very end. And now my daughter sits with me and watches. She's 8 years old. She's sort of looking up to see who, the wardrobe person was. And I say that because it's interesting that those are the people that are responsible for constructing and putting this thing together that you hold on to, this nostalgic thing. And yet, the credit to those folks goes flying past you at the end of the film. You have to really look for it in some cases to see. My friend Colt is in the audience somewhere up there, and he's worked on many films, and I'll sit there waiting, looking for Colt's name, and it's like, there it is! For me, it's a very important moment that flies past, and I've always thought that it was really beautiful the way that those kind of credits scroll through. So in the piece upstairs, I really thought that there's this continuum of names, of dehumanized names that go flying through history, and they get reused, actually. I mean, there are names like the Black Assassins used multiple times by the boxers. The Beast, I think, is used multiple times. So I think that act of recycling a name that's attached to somebody and using it for another is also kind of fascinating. So I really like that kind of movement through the room. It's such a stunning room, the architecture and everything, that you really don't want to play too much with that. You want to play with it, not against it. It's not
I don't want to hate the architect, and I certainly don't want the architects to hate me. So I think it was more of a recognition. You walk in that room and you instantly look up.
To me, it feels like a perfect interweaving of artwork in space.
Yeah. Thank you.
And you know, film credits. Going back to film credits, you know, as a signifier, they function as signifiers of finality, of something ending, right? But let's remember the piece is called "Frozen in Time," so that kind of reinforces the sense of the impossibility of something ending, the impossibility of something resolving. So, in a way that I think is very sophisticated, very abstract, but at the same time very clear. Somehow it manages to be both abstract and clear at the same time. You're bringing together this idea of a history that has not been resolved, a history that cannot be resolved, it's frozen.
And yet we try to melt it.
Sorry?
And yet we try to melt it. You know, it's you know, that kind of frozen moment is always, you know.
And the erasure effect, I think, really reinforces this idea of something kind of stuck, something trapped. So I think on that note, it's a good time for us to switch to questions.
Thank you. That was good.
There's someone with a microphone, so if you want to just raise your hand, they'll bring the microphone. Oh, that's not here.
Gary, can you talk about the process of not so much the drawing process, but the next process where you put those white gloves on, about what you're doing, what you're thinking about, and can you mess that up? And do you ever spend a lot of time making a drawing and then put the gloves on to give it the kind of jittery effect that you create, and do you ever mess it up and go, I got to start all over again?
How did you see me with the white gloves on, you sneaky Pete?
You don't have to talk about it if you don't.
You know, well, it's interesting because I always thought of the erasures as being the performance that you never see. It's the traces that are left behind from a performance. And, you know, I think that they sort of come from an emotional place. I think that there are drawings that I can even see. It depends on how I wake up. You know, I'll wake up and I'll be in a really angry mood, and I'm, you know, pissed off with my own work or the issues that I'm dealing with, and it shows in the work. And there's other times when you're almost like finessing the image. You know, I think Rene was watching me at one point where, you know, I'm violently kind of erasing the thing, and I'll go back into it, and I'm sort of like feather touching it. Do I mess it up? You know, I've gone back into drawings after, but I kind of tend to not. I think that usually, you know, I'll leave mistakes in, because I think that some of the most interesting parts of production happen in the mistakes. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so drawn, no pun intended, to drawing. I think that if I was to collect, not that I'm advising anybody on collecting, but if I personally was to collect art, I would collect artist drawings. Because I think that artist drawings are the purest, most honest moments of an artist making work. It's where you're comfortable. You know, if I said, Dennis, how do I get to your house? You're instantly going to draw me like this little paper, you know, drawing thing, and you're not thinking about that drawing. That's those moments that I want. So I would leave, you know, most of the accidents that happen. If it's like a really radical thing, I would probably go back and change it. But ordinarily, I like to leave it because it really, truly is a trace of what I was doing. So, yeah, I believe it's all like close.
Hi. The piece has the names are in sort of different fonts, and could you talk about the quality of those fonts and the choice in the variations?
That's interesting you pick that. The fonts are old spaghetti western fonts from those, you know, like the good, the bad, the ugly, and hang 'em high, and things like that. Where there were sort of little references, playful moments myself with films that really fascinate me. Things that also mirror or are similar to the ideas of two combatants. I always like the gunslingers, like those old movies. Like I'll make a whole thing of popcorn and sit and watch Clint Eastwood movies. I don't identify with politics, but I definitely would, watch the good, the bad, the ugly all afternoon when we're 89. So I think that it's more of a reference to that and kind of coupling the idea of the combatants together and the way that we think about spaghetti westerns and that what we call spaghetti westerns.
Hi, I was just wondering how much boxing you've actually done. Because the way that you describe working with the work, it's like you're sparring with it. And so I'm getting these images of you, working, and I just wanted to see if you have a physical connection between the two actions, or if you've done any training.
That's a good question. No, I haven't done any boxing, personal boxing. My dad did. He has huge hands. He's like big old hands. And I spent a lot of time in boxing gyms. And I think that the work that goes into those guys when they're training is it's impressive. It's amazing to go into a boxing. And everybody should go into a boxing gym wants to just see the movements of people practicing, training on speed, all that kind of thing. It's amazing to watch. The dedication and the way that they treat their bodies it's fascinating. Personally, no, I haven't. I mean, I think when I was a teenager, I spent my time in little fisticuff moments, but not in a ring.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you have a chance to see the